Hi, you're listening to Stephan Livera podcast, a show about Bitcoin and Austrian economics brought to you by Swan.com. Are Bitcoin's 4-year cycles over? My friend and regular guest Vijay Boyapati rejoins me on the show, and he has a great way of thinking about these questions and explaining his thoughts on where we are in the economy today. Are we in a recession? What's happening with that 18-month lag? Is Bitcoin becoming a macro asset? And what does this mean for 4-year cycles? So here's my discussion with Vijay. Vijay, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Stephan. It's always great to chat with you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has. It has been a little while. And, it's just, there's all these updates happening broader in the world of macro, as well as stuff happening in the world of Bitcoin. But I think it'll be interesting mostly to start with what's happening in the economics, finance, macro sort of world. I think the big question for a lot of people is, are we in a recession now, or are we going into one? Do you have any views on that?
It's an interesting question because I think a lot of people would have assumed that if the Federal Reserve was going to increase interest rates as quickly as they did and as much as they did, it's like hitting the brakes on an economy, really slamming on the brakes. We would be in a recession. We're kind of in this bifurcated world where some of the economy, and I should start by saying I'm coming from a very US-centric perspective, but a lot of what I say will apply to the rest of the world as well. But we have this bifurcated economy in the US where some parts of the economy are already in a very deep recession or the beginnings of a very deep recession. And you look at the real estate market, it's completely frozen up. It's the lowest level of housing transactions, I think, in recorded history. And part of that is when the Federal Reserve increases interest rates as much as it has, the cost of buying is much, much higher. The interest rate that you're going to pay on a house has gone from somewhere around 3% to above 7%, heading towards 8%. This is a dramatic change, and this means that if you're going to a bank and you're getting a loan to buy a house, it's going to cost you more than double your monthly mortgage payment. And so for a lot of people, they're just not able to service that debt. Like their salary hasn't more than doubled. Their salary may have increased a little bit. And so on the demand side, you have a massive shrinkage in demand. But also on the supply side, naturally, when you have a shrinkage in demand, what will happen is that prices will come down so that supply and demand could come into an equilibrium. But you have this problem in the housing market where you have a lot of people who borrowed on their houses before the Fed dramatically increased its interest rates, and so they're sitting on mortgage rates of 3.5%. They just don't want to sell. Why would you sell? If you sell, then, you want somewhere to live. You're going to sell your house, and then you're going to go out into the mortgage market again and get another mortgage for a new house. But it's going to be dramatically more expensive to do that. So you have a freezing of supply. People who normally might want to move are thinking twice about that. They're saying, do I really want to sell my house? I have this 3% mortgage. It's really, really cheap to live in this house. Whereas if I move to a new house, the cost of servicing that mortgage is going to be much, much higher. So you have this sort of stasis in the mortgage market that I have not seen in my lifetime. It's a really strange market because normal markets adjust very quickly and price moves to get supply and demand into equilibrium. But you don't have the price moving because the market itself is frozen. People are much, more reluctant to buy, and sellers are much more reluctant to sell. So the volume of transactions has really dried up completely. So that's one part. I guess getting back to your question, that's one part of the economy that's really, I think it would be fair to say, is in a deep recession. But then there are other parts of the economy, like the service sector, which is still booming. Like you go to cities across the United States, and there are help wanted signs everywhere. Every restaurant wants help. They can't find enough people to work. So if you're working in the service sector, you get to pick and choose your job, and your salary is going up quite rapidly. And this is a combination of factors. This is a combination of the massive stimulus that the US government pumped into the economy, and also, governments across the world did this during COVID. They were really worried it would go into this cataclysmic depression, and so they did something which is a much more direct stimulus, and it's very different. I like to contrast this to the monetary stimulus of the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, when the Federal Reserve intervened by using quantitative easing. The stimulus during COVID was a fiscal stimulus. They basically helicopter dropped money onto the economy. They gave people checks. They literally gave you a check. So people were getting checks in the mail. Like, I've got $2,000 more. And that money gets straight into the economy. It's like injecting it directly into the veins of the economy. And the combination of that money being available in the hands of the middle class, lower middle class, who tend to want to spend money when they get money in their hand. The combination of that and the fact that people had so much pent-up demand from these ridiculous COVID lockdowns, which prevented them, they stripped away people's lives, right? You're taking away 2 years of people's lives where they would normally do things that were important. We're social animals. We like to visit people. We like to travel. We like to have experiences. That was taken away. And so, in the COVID lockdowns, and now you have this massive pent-up demand of people wanting to travel and go to restaurants and just live like humans. Plus, they've been given all this money. And so that really quickly flowed into the economy and put a lot of demand on the service sector. So that's actually where a lot of the inflation came from, the price inflation, is that people had the money in their hand. There was extra money that was printed and directly given to people, plus the pent-up demand of not being able to do anything during the lockdowns. So we have this very interesting contrast in the economy. You have parts of the economy which are very interest rate sensitive, which is the housing market, for instance, which is just in a complete depression, and also, I should mention one other part of the real estate market, which is commercial real estate, which is a really, really big part of the economy. That is also in what I would call a Great Depression in parts of the United States, like San Francisco, Seattle, some of the major cities. You'll go to the downtown areas, which, have these office buildings, and they're completely empty. They're like ghost towns. And part of that is related to the COVID shift as well. It's the fact that, governments locked down entire countries and people had to find alternative ways of working, which forced people into this new culture of work from home. And what they realized was, hey, wow, actually we can work from home. Companies shifted their internal policies and said, okay, yep, this is possible. People can still be productive, maybe not as productive, but they can still be productive. And it's caused a really big shift in the economy where you just don't need as much commercial real estate. So the commercial real estate market has been hit with this double whammy, which is this shift towards work from home culture and the higher interest rates. The commercial real estate market, it has this same kind of problem of being completely frozen, where the people who own the commercial real estate and have taken lots of loans are just kind of sitting on it because they don't want to sell. If you sell into a market that's this distressed, you're going to take a massive, massive write down. And what they're doing is they're hoping, maybe we can wait this out. Maybe this will change. Maybe in a year or two, the market will pick up. If it doesn't, you're going to see massive liquidation on the debt in commercial real estate, and that's going to flow through the economy, and then you're going to start seeing more of the kind of financial crisis recession that you would expect in a typical recession. So this is a very weird situation. You have parts of the economy which look like they're booming, which is a service sector, and then you have parts of the economy like the real estate market, which are in, bordering on depression territory. So one extra comment I want to make is it's one of the dirty secrets of monetary policy that monetary policy is mainly transmitted through the real estate market. That's how it's traditionally been transmitted. You increase or decrease interest rates, and the way that stimulates the economy and creates more money is that banks lend that money. They have an incentive to lend money into the economy, and the primary mechanism is through the real estate market. Most regular people like you and I, our interactions with the bank, the major interaction is to get a mortgage. And that's the mechanism that the Fed uses. The economy is becoming less interest rate sensitive, which makes the Fed's problem more difficult. There are big parts of the economy where the Fed moving rates up isn't really changing much at all. There are corporations which have taken out very long-term debt prior to COVID, like 20-year debt, 30-year debt, at very, very low interest rates. So the Fed increasing interest rates doesn't do anything to those corporations. It doesn't affect them. It doesn't necessarily throw them into a tailspin. So how this resolves is a really interesting question, because you have this lopsided economy, and it's a question of, is this the part of the economy that's in a depression, is it going to pull everything else down eventually, or is the other part going to be strong enough that we're not going to go into a traditional typical recession where you see major unemployment increases and shifts from one sector to another as the economy rebalances? So it's an open question that I'm not entirely sure how this is going to play out, but it's a very different situation to 2008, 2009.
Right. And so if one were to just copy the pattern from before, you might be tempted to just think, well, it's like that moment when, Wile E. Coyote's run off the cliff, but he hasn't fallen down yet. And so, right. You might think, hey, actually, the economy is like that. We've sort of run off the cliff yet, but we haven't hit the results yet, because maybe, the interest rates have risen so dramatically. And as you said, there's a lot of people who have not moved homes because of this, because they don't want to move into a higher interest rate mortgage or debt. So I wonder if that's, maybe that's part of the situation we're in, that the shoe is yet to drop. I'm curious if you're seeing it that way, or you see it's like, actually, it's not like that.
I think that's actually a really good analogy, maybe for a slightly different reason, because monetary policy has these lag effects. When you increase interest rates, it doesn't immediately change the economy. Things sort of keep going for a while until, like, for instance, if you have some debt which you got at 3% at a much lower rate, and if you're a small business, for example, and you got 5-year debt at a lower interest rate, the higher interest rate will only affect you when you have to go and get more debt, or you have to service your debt. That's when it affects you. And so you have these lag effects, and they're typically seen to be about 18 months. So the full impact of the Fed's increase in rates is probably not going to be seen until somewhere at the end of this year, maybe mid next year, and then we'll start feeling them. So what you said is exactly right. It's Wile E. Coyote sort of spinning his legs, waiting for that 18-month lag effect, and then I expect that there will be some impact. I do expect that we're going to go into a recession. It seems almost inconceivable to me that you can go from zero interest rates to changing the risk-free interest rate, which is the rate that you get paid on cash, to 5% and not have a dramatic impact on the economy in general. It also really sucks money out of a whole bunch of different sectors, because all of a sudden you have real return on cash. And this affects the stock market, because people see, there's a comparative advantage now to keeping money in cash. I don't need to invest as much in the stock market because I'm getting a real return on cash, and it's zero risk. And it also, interestingly, getting back to our favorite topic, it has an effect on monetary goods. It has an effect on Bitcoin. It has an effect on gold. Because those things do really well when you have negative real interest rates, because then you're punished for holding cash. And when you're punished for holding cash, you look for alternatives to cash. Like, what can I hold where I'm not being punished? And you look for things like Bitcoin or gold to keep your savings in. When you get a real rate of return on cash in the bank, it's almost like this great sucking of capital out from those monetary goods back into cash. This is why, gold after 1980 did quite poorly for a really long time, because Paul Volcker increased the interest rate dramatically up to almost 20%. And so you were getting really a significant amount of yield on your cash. And so the punishment of a negative real interest rate that people had in the 70s that pushed people into gold was completely reversed. So that's what we have now. The real question, though, is how long can the Fed maintain the interest rate at this level without breaking something? Is it possible that the system as a whole, the financial system as a whole, can survive with interest rates this high? My view is it's probably not possible. And the reason is because in the background you have this massive debt problem. Nations around the world have debt levels that are the highest they've been in 70 or 80 years. They're like wartime levels of debt, the same kind of levels of debt that the US had when it was in World War II, and it went into massive debt to pay for armaments and sending munitions and stuff to Europe. We have that same debt level in peacetime. So we have to service that debt. The United States has to service that debt, and it now has to service that debt at 5% interest rate rather than 0% interest rate, which makes it much, much harder to service. And that starts showing up in the budget of the US government, where there's a chunk of the budget, there's a chunk of the budget's for defense, a chunk is for social security, a chunk is for education, and you can look at all these different chunks. A chunk is just for paying interest on the debt. And that chunk is getting big. It's getting really big. And as the debt starts ballooning, eventually what you have is that chunk becomes so big that you're crowding out any other spending. And then the government has to think about defaulting on its obligations. Like, can we pay Social Security? Can we pay Medicare? We're not quite there yet in the United States. We're not quite at that crisis moment. There are other nations like Japan which are closer to that crisis moment. But that is a big concern, as one of the key questions. Can the Federal Reserve maintain interest rates at this level for a prolonged period of time? I don't think they believe that they can internally. If I was a fly on the wall and I was listening to them, I think internally they're probably saying stuff like, we need to get inflation back in the bottle. We need to convince the market that we're credible, that when we say we want 2% inflation, we are credible about that. And once it's back in the bottle, we need to bring interest rates back down, because long-term, the United States government, which the Federal Reserve is really a part of, will not be able to survive with interest rates this high.
Yeah, really interesting. There's lots of things that come to me there, because if interest rates remain high and the government wants to repay that debt, over time, it's going to necessitate a few things. One, big spending cuts, and two, big tax hikes. And that's going to be extremely unpopular unless they find a way to, let's say, eat the rich or tax the rich. But even then, it won't be enough, because they're already, the rich, the top 1% or even higher, they're paying a very disproportionate share of the governmental tax burden. So that's going to be really difficult. But there are other ways that they might try to, let's say, kick the can. And maybe another way is to hide the inflation. And so that's another way where, as an example, they can just say, oh, look, CPI is low, therefore you shouldn't be complaining. And, they can sort of have their cake and eat it too, a little bit, not all the way, but they can sort of have it a little bit, because they can have this view of, oh, look, CPI's gone down, and, now we can lower the rates a little bit. What do you think?
I think that's their hope. I think certainly the Federal Reserve wants to get CPI down below 2%. I just thought of one comment I wanted to make about that. there's been a lot of talk recently about why doesn't the Federal Reserve just change its target? Why didn't they change it from 2% to 3% or 4% or something like that? And I think there's actually a really important reason that they're not doing that. The Federal Reserve has one asset that's incredibly important to it, and that's its credibility. If they lose their credibility, then they lose the ability to transmit their monetary policy into the economy. Because if people don't believe them, when the Federal Reserve says we're going to get inflation under control, that actually has a real impact on inflation. This is kind of one of those things which is an interesting feedback loop, but it affects people's expectations in the economy. So if you believe that inflation, the Federal Reserve is credible, and that they say they're going to get inflation back down to 2%, you're not going to go to your employer and say, look, you have to give me a 5% raise. You have to give me that raise because I think inflation is going to be high. I don't trust the Federal Reserve anymore. And then you get this kind of wage spiral where people are asking for more salary, and then companies are like, oh, we have this new cost, which is we have to pay employees more, so we have to increase prices to be able to pay our employees, and then the costs go up. And then people are like, well, costs are going up at 5 or 6%. The Federal Reserve doesn't seem to be able to stop that. I want more of an increase in my salary. And this is one of the effects that you saw during the inflation of the 1970s, is that people were demanding higher salaries, and that was feeding through into other prices as well. So the Federal Reserve's credibility is incredibly important, and that's why I think they are actually quite focused on getting CPI. They want CPI to come down to maintain their credibility, and then do what I think you said that they want to do, which is to then bring interest rates back down, because ultimately they have to make it possible for the US government to continue to exist and to service its debt. And I just don't see that it's possible in the long term. The debt to GDP ratio in the United States now is like 130%, and that's not even counting the massive Medicare and Social Security obligations. So you can't maintain that kind of debt at 5% interest rates. So it's like, how are they going to thread this needle? It's a really, really difficult problem. And I think internally, they're probably talking about this question: how are we going to get through this in the long term? The real solution is exactly what you said. That you have to take the pain of higher taxes and lower spending. But that's politically almost impossible in the United States. In a country as divided and polarized as the United States, how do you do the economically prudent, responsible thing when everyone kind of hates each other? The easiest thing to do is promise everyone everything that they want. Like, we're going to have Social Security forever and Medicare as soon as you get to 60 years old, and all of the benefits that you were promised, they're not going to go away, and we're going to continue financing being the policeman of the world. It's not sustainable. Something eventually has to crack, and probably the way it's going to crack is through inflation, because governments just tend to want to avoid, democratic governments especially, because they're so short-term oriented and they just want to please their voters. The path of least resistance is to solve the problem through inflation. When you have this much debt, eventually you can't service it. What do? Do you default on the debt? Do you do the politically difficult thing, which is to reduce spending and increase taxes? Or do you do the thing which people don't really understand is happening, and it kind of is insidious, and do you inflate? That's what governments have always done long term. So I think my view is long term. That is what's going to happen. This is going to be resolved. The debt problem, the global debt problem, is going to be resolved through inflation.
Back to the show in a moment. The lead sponsor of this show is Swan.com, and Swan is putting on Pacific Bitcoin Festival. It's coming up again this year in LA, October 5th and 6th. And speaking of, Vijay is one of the guests who has been announced as a speaker, alongside other top-notch speakers such as Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert, Lynn Alden, Corey Clipston, Alex Gladstein, Greg Foss, Jimmy Song, and so many more. I'm going to be there, of course, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there. There will be a main stage for dedicated talks, panels, fireside chats, as well as a Swan Dome with deep dive sessions and advanced topics and deeper discussions, as well as all other kinds of activities going on. There will be a general ticket available and also a VIP ticket for those of you who want preferred seating, viewing areas for the main stage, a private lounge for networking and connection. You'll get open VIP bar access and complimentary lunch. So whether you are getting the general admission ticket or a VIP ticket, bring some friends and family along. This is an unmissable event. I hope to see you all there. Go get your tickets at pacificbitcoin.com. Use code Livera for a discount. Are you still using a plain old block explorer? Bitcoin has grown beyond a single layer. It's a multi-layer ecosystem, and Mempool.Space is the leading Bitcoin explorer that allows you to see the mempool, the blockchain, second layer networks like the Lightning Network, and you don't even have to trust a third party. You can host it yourself. It's available on some of the full node distros like Umbrel, Raspberry Blitz, and so on. With Mempool.Space, they are continually innovating, so they have new features all the time. They have added Mempool version 3.0 recently, and so they've got Mempool blocks that are scrollable, they forked Electras, you can visualize full RBF, and they've got a Mempool accelerator integration coming. So you can find out more over at Mempool.Space. Now back to the episode. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's the most likely long-term scenario. So then it's really more about how do you play that cycle, whether if you're an investor or as an individual, how do you survive, right? How do you stay solvent to make it through to that other side? And I think the other aspect that I think is interesting, and as I'm sure you can appreciate, is when we're in a fiat fractional reserve system, they need continual expansion to sort of keep the party going. They need this continual expansion because people have it in their minds that, oh, property doubles every 7 to 10 years, right? They don't think of that in real terms. They just think, oh, property just, I bought this property or whatever 10 years ago and it's already doubled. And look at me, I'm twice as rich now. Obviously, they're not thinking about, maintenance cost, inflation, and all these other aspects of it. But the system requires that. And what happens when the system doesn't get what it needs to survive?
Oh, that's a great question. And, there's two sides to the coin to the fractional reserve system. New money is created by banks lending it out into the economy. They take the base money supply and they multiply it out, and it creates this kind of broader money supply, which is really the primary driver of inflation. That's the kind of pushing money out into the economy. But you also have to understand that there's a pull as well. Money is created by the issuance of debt. So a bank gives a loan to someone to buy a mortgage, and suddenly there's that extra money that's in the economy. The person who receives the payment puts it into a bank, and then they have more money to spend. But eventually, the person who has the loan has to pay down the loan, right? So that's a dragging force that brings money back out of the economy. And eventually, if you have so much debt and you can't service it, you get a much more powerful pulling force. You need the pushing force of pushing money through new loans to be more powerful than the pulling force. But you can only have that if you have underlying real growth. Because if you don't have underlying real growth, you're going to get bad loans, and you're going to get people can't service their debt because there's no underlying wealth creation. And when you have that, that's when the loan starts drying up, because it's almost like banks are drug dealers giving out hits of drugs to druggies, right? And they're like, oh yeah, this feels great, and they're taking more and more drugs, and it looks like the market is booming. But eventually, the drug addict taps out. Their body can't handle anymore. Especially if they're, not healthy. If the economy's not healthy and doesn't have underlying real growth, the banks are going to have to stop just because there's not going to be demand for loans. And that's when the system goes in reverse and you start seeing debt deflation. The question is, where is that level? Where is the level where we just have too much debt and the drug addict is completely tapped out, and you can't push more drugs onto them because they'll just die? That's an open question. It's not clear what that level is. Is it 150% of GDP? Is it 200% of GDP? That's an open question, and when that moment happens, the problem is when it happens very quickly, and everything unwinds very quickly and is completely chaotic. So one thing I think is really important to think about is, will we have some amount of underlying growth that can save us? Or have we seen the end of this big cycle of productivity that we've been in for the last 40 years and we're tapped out? We saw two very powerful factors that contributed to global growth in the last 40 years. One was Moore's Law, which was the constant doubling of computational power every 18 months, had a massive impact on global productivity, because every time your computer gets more powerful, you can do new things that you weren't able to do. Like with your iPhone today, you can do stuff that people could not have even dreamed of 40 years ago, just with a little device in your hand. The other factor was the bringing into the global economy the workforce of China and India. Those two workforces were kind of detached from the global economy. So globalization, which dramatically lowered labor rates. You have China producing everything with cheap labor, plus you have Moore's Law. Those two forces are largely tapped out. China is no longer, a very, very cheap place to manufacture. It's sort of catching up to the West. They have a middle class now. And Moore's Law as well is kind of tapped out as well. So the two main drivers of productivity, I think, are tapped out. The question is there going to be something that's going to replace that gives us the underlying wealth creation that makes this debt level serviceable? That's a really tough question. Could it be AI? Could it be something else in biotech that gives us a new boom in growth? Not clear. I'm not sure. Those two things that we had in the last 40 years were so powerful, it's going to be really hard to replace them.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's not quite clear where the next leg up of growth is going to come. I think there is going to need to be some pain, sadly, right? I think there's going to have to be a bit of pain. But there's also opportunities too. But bringing it to Bitcoin as well, this is something where people have been arguing about this for years. They have been saying, well, is Bitcoin a risk-on asset? And it's something that likes low interest rates. And then in the other camp, and maybe the long-term view is, no, actually, Bitcoin is the safety thing. It's actually what people should be running to for safety. So how do you sort of disentangle those ideas in your mind? Do you see it like it's a risk-on asset, or are you seeing it more like, find safety in sats?
Yeah, I tweeted about this a couple of years ago, and the way I summarize it is that Bitcoin is a risk-on asset that's becoming a risk-off asset. That's the process of monetization. You have something which has very little value 10 years ago, a bit more than that now. I guess Bitcoin's been around for a while now. Let's say 14 years ago, it didn't have a market price, and now is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's certainly a risk-on asset in that early stage of monetization, because who knows if it's going to be monetized. There's tremendous risk around regulation, the technology, the risk of copycats, forks, all of these risks who are there. So it's definitely risk on. Eventually, when it gets to significant enough size where enough people own it, let's say 20-30% of the global population owns it, then it's a risk off asset. It's become like a de facto means of savings, of keeping your savings, that in times of stress, people will move their money to Bitcoin. I do think, though, that Bitcoin has achieved enough scale that one of the risks to Bitcoin that I wrote about in my book is that it's now sensitive to interest rate policy. I don't think that would have been true in, say, 2013 or 2014. Because it was small enough, it was almost like a penny stock, that the dominant factor was just the number of people who were jumping into Bitcoin, who were excited about it, libertarians and cypherpunks, and just that crowd of people jumping in could dramatically increase regardless of what interest rates are when it's something that small. It's like, a high growth, very small company can do really well even if the economy is in a major recession. Actually, I started my career at a company like that. It was called Google. And we're in the dot-com bust, and Google was just growing like crazy, and all of the other companies in Silicon Valley were firing their employees, and Google was gobbling them up like, great engineers, we want more and more great engineers, because it was small enough. But eventually Google gets big enough that it's a big part of the economy, and it's really affected by the economy, that if the economy goes into recession now, there's no way Google can escape it. It's going to be affected. But when it's really tiny, it's going through that growth phase, it can still do that without being affected. And I think the same is true for Bitcoin. It's now achieved a scale where macro factors do affect Bitcoin, and interest rate policy does affect Bitcoin. That's why I think this bull market, the last bull market cycle was kind of cut off a little unnaturally. It didn't look like, I think a lot of us expected that Bitcoin would get to 100,000. I actually believe it would have if the Federal Reserve hadn't made such a dramatic change to its policy. After over a decade of easy money, they just went crazy and went up to 5% very, very quickly. If that hadn't happened, I think the Bitcoin bull market would have reached a level that most people would have expected. So Bitcoin is now big enough that it is a macro asset, and it will be affected by macro factors.
That's a really good point. And I think another corollary might well be that this idea of 4-year cycles needs to be thrown out the window, perhaps. I'm curious to get your view on that, because now, let me set the scene a little bit. I think over time, of course, Bitcoin has been super volatile, but at the same time, people can't help but look back and see, oh, wow, okay, hang on, there's like this kind of 4-year pattern of like crazy bull run and then bear market, then kind of a bit of a boring middle part, and then another bull run. And if you look at 2013, 2017, 2021, it seems to play out, and it's so seductive to just think, oh, well, it's just going to be the same thing. Well, obviously 2021, add another 4 years, it's going to be 2025, right? For sure, guaranteed, right? Obviously not. We don't know that. But I'm curious then, if your point is that Bitcoin is now more sensitive to the broader macro environment, does that mean maybe the 4-year cycle thing is the wrong idea to have in our minds? What do you think?
I think the 4-year cycle is a legitimate construct, and we've observed it to be true. And I think the reason is because of the halving. The halving is kind of something which forces sort of disequilibrium in supply and demand that happens every 4 years, where you get this bull run and then people get excited and it gets to this, climax, and then there aren't enough people to feed it, because one of my observations is each cycle has a cohort of people who are reachable in that cycle. In the first cycle, it was cypherpunks, and then it was like libertarians and early investors, and then it's the broader public. And then it's the laggards, the people who are just really late to everything. And so the number of people reachable in the first cycle is actually pretty small, right? There aren't that many cypherpunks on Earth who were there in 2011 to feed that cycle. So the cycle ends, and then you get a crash because people got ahead of themselves. And eventually you get this price plateau, this boring level where people are like, well, the price is low enough that I want to buy it at this level. And you have these people who are steady accumulators. And so supply and demand find this equilibrium. And then, after 4 years, the equilibrium's broken because of the halving. So the amount of supply that's being brought onto the market gets halved. And so now demand is above supply, and that starts pulling the price up slowly but surely, and then people recognize that, oh, the price is moving up, and then they start jumping in, and then you get this, madness of crowds phenomenon where it goes parabolic again. So I don't think that part is gone. I think that part is still there. But you now have to blend that with the fact that Bitcoin is big enough that it'll be affected by macro factors as well. So it's not going to be a perfect fractal like it was in the past, where you could, superimpose 2017 on 2013 and be like, wow, these look really similar, just at a different scale. You could have things that cut a bull market short, or maybe even extend it. Like, imagine that we have the halving in 2024 and then suddenly something breaks in the financial system and the Federal Reserve's like, we need to dramatically decrease interest rates. Those two things combined could accelerate the bull market and perhaps make it bigger than we expect. So I think that the 4-year cycle is intact because Bitcoin has this natural thing which triggers the cycle, which is the halving. But now we have to also, in the back of our heads, think about what's happening in the broader macro picture and how might that affect a monetary good like Bitcoin.
Yeah. So when it comes to the 4-year cycle, and as you rightly say, of course, every 4 years the halving happens, and so the new block subsidy is halved, and so certainly I agree with you there, and there's some dynamics there for miners. But then I'm also curious. Do you believe that effect might be diminishing over time too? Because what happens now is a lot of the coins have already been issued, right? Or, have been created, let's say 90% or roughly in that range. And so there's now a lot of the coins that are already with existing hodlers as opposed to new coins being mined. So do you believe then that the 4-year cycle and the halving point specifically still is a big factor, or do you think it could also just be that, well, it's about how many hodlers there are as opposed to the halving changing things?
There's two ways to think about this. Certainly it's true that the percentage of Bitcoins as a fraction of the total supply coming onto the market is much smaller. But at the same time, you have this other factor that the price level of Bitcoin, the total market capitalization, is much, much bigger as well. So even though it represents a smaller fraction, the amount of money that has to come into the Bitcoin market every day to maintain the price level is much, much higher. I could do a calculation, but it's millions of dollars need to come into the Bitcoin market. You just need to multiply the subsidy by, number of blocks per hour times the current Bitcoin price, and then you get like how much dollars need to come into the market to maintain the price level. So even if it's a smaller fraction of the total, you still need that new financial energy coming into the market. And when you have the halving, the amount of financial energy that needs to come into the market to maintain the current price level of $26,000 is not as much. And that's going to push the price up. So I think it still has an effect, and it has an effect because Bitcoin finds a new price level where the halving still has an impact just by the fact that the total market cap has increased significantly.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I can't fault you there. So when it comes to trust and building trust over time, this is something you recently commented as well, where you were pointing out the level of trust that people have in gold and the level of trust people have in Bitcoin. So can you elaborate on that idea of building trust over time in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest advantages that gold has over Bitcoin is it's this ancient money that people have been using for thousands of years, and so people just assume that gold is going to be around for the next 1,000 years because it was the last 5,000 or 6,000 years of human civilization. The question is, how quickly can Bitcoin achieve a similar level of trust? And one of the arguments I make is that it's asymptotic, that it happens very quickly, that people's perception that something is permanent has it existed during my lifetime? So think about kids who were born when Bitcoin was created. They're 14 years old now. 5 years from now, these kids are going to enter the workforce, and their entire life, they don't know a world without Bitcoin. It's kind of like a lot of kids today who are in the workforce don't know a world without the internet. I'm old enough, and I have the gray hairs to prove it, that I remember a world prior to the internet and what that was like, and how different that world was. But kids today don't. To them, the internet is a permanent fixture of the world, right? It's never going away because they can't even imagine a world where the internet didn't exist. That's going to be true for a whole generation of people entering the workforce in the next 5 or 6 years. And for them, I think their perception of Bitcoin's permanence will be very close to gold. they'll hear stories about gold's been around forever, but their experience, their personal experience is, well, Bitcoin's been around forever. I don't remember a world without Bitcoin. And I think that really flips people's thinking on, is this an asset that I can invest in? Is this something that I can put my savings in and have a sense that it's still going to be around in 10 years from now? For people who are older, people who are in their 60s or 70s, they might look at Bitcoin and be like, oh, this thing's just come around the last decade. I don't know if I can trust this to be around. But as people age and young people become old people, that perception is going to change. And my view is it takes about 2 decades for that's for an entire generation to grow up. It takes about 2 decades for those people to have a completely changed perception of a new technology and to accept it as, this is permanent, this has always been around, and that starts filtering out into the economy, because those people are now earning money. And they're going to treat Bitcoin as an asset which is going to exist forever. And it's going to be part of their portfolio. And they're going to think about it as a very normal part of their portfolio. I think actually people who are growing up today, who will be in their 20s in the next 5 or 6 years, they're going to be much more likely to have Bitcoin as a part of their portfolio than gold.
Excellent. And how do you think then about the idea that a lot of the wealth is held by older people? So let's say the boomer generation, maybe it's the Gen X generation. So even though there are a lot of young people coming up through the ranks, they don't currently hold the wealth. But I guess you would say that, over time, it'll just flow down, right? Obviously, as people age, they pass away, and then they pass wealth down to their children. And so then maybe that's another pathway that Bitcoin just over time replaces other assets as our savings asset.
Yeah, definitely. It's just a natural cycle of human life that eventually that wealth is going to pass down to people. I will say, though, that millennials are definitely lagging in terms of the wealth that they've accumulated compared to the boomers, and part of that is just structural. They're growing up in a time where their nations are saddled with so much debt and their opportunities are less. They're really the first generation who can't really expect to have a higher standard of living than their parents, which is really sad. Every generation for the last 100 years or so has thought, I'm going to have a better standard of living than my parents. The millennials are the first to not have that the case. They do have one advantage, though. That advantage is Bitcoin. They are so much more intimately familiar with Bitcoin and much more comfortable with owning it. The monetization of Bitcoin could be the big wealth transformation that helps millennials catch up to the boomers as wealth moves from all these traditional assets, which are not really ideal forms of saving, to Bitcoin, which is an ideal form of saving. That will help millennials catch up. And the fact that they are comfortable with it, that they've grown up with it, gives them a big advantage over people who are in their 70s who still have that hesitancy. Except a few instances like Uncle Bill in Canberra, who is in his 70s and is just as familiar with Bitcoin as any millennial.
Back to the show in a moment. Coinkite.com is the creator of the Cold Card, my favorite Bitcoin hardware device. It's very reliable, it's very easy to set up, and you can use it without phoning home. It's an ultra-secure device, and it has so much versatility in the features it offers. You can just use it in a standard 12-word or 24-word seed, single signature, or you can have a passphrase, you can have a BrickMe pin, you can have a Duress pin, you can have seed XOR, you can use it as part of multi-signature. The options are just endless. So you will actually learn a lot about Bitcoin by using a Cold Card, because it'll expose some of those interesting details that you will then need to learn about. So it's actually a really great tool for learning about Bitcoin also. Coinkite also offer a range of accessories, so the steel seed plate, the block clock, the tap signer, and the Sats card are also available for sale. You can get all of this over at coinkite.com. Use code Livera for a discount on your Cold Cards. Now, if you're listening to the show and you want to get involved in Bitcoin somehow, or you want to build something in Bitcoin, look at Base 58. Base 58 is a Bitcoin protocol school where you can get guidance in your Bitcoin developer education. Base 58 has classes and materials ranging from beginner developers all the way up to expert level classes. They have online classes as well as in-person intensive classes where you can learn in a guided pathway rather than having to figure it all out for yourself. They have a Taproot intensive in-person class coming up soon. This is going to cover using Taproot, TapScript, Schnorr, Frost, and Music 2. This in-person Taproot intensive class is coming up just prior to TabConf in Atlanta from the 4th to the 6th of September, and this class is on again in Austin, Texas, 13th to 15th of November. Go to base58.info or see the link in description to sign up and learn Bitcoin development. And now, back to the show. Yeah, for sure. And I think we are seeing that in practice, especially in cases where people are traveling around the world. I think people in other countries often don't trust their government as much. They don't trust the state as much. Whereas, let's say in the big Western states, it's a little bit more likely that they'll trust the government, they'll trust the state. I'm seeing that, at least in terms of people I talk to, especially people who are coming from a country where they've had currency issues. They are much more likely to sort of understand the point of Bitcoin and using it. And, I think I'm seeing that even sometimes when people I talk to, they're sort of starting to come around to the idea of, oh, okay, yeah, I can actually just use this Bitcoin thing and I can transfer it around the world without having to ask, right? I actually had an example today, or not today, but just yesterday, where I was onboarding a person and got them on Phoenix Wallet, and they were literally asking, I didn't have to do verification. I just received sats. I received the money. I guess it's mind blowing. Obviously for people like you and I, and probably for listeners of this show, it's not a new thing, right? But every
it's
day,
a beautiful
there's new
thing,
people.
though,
Yeah.
seeing that experience, because I think most of us have had that experience earlier on in our introduction to Bitcoin, where it's so magical. You really feel what the innovation to Bitcoin is, to be able to transmit value across the world without any intermediary, which is the innovation that Satoshi made possible. And this is the first time in history that this has been possible. When you first experience that, it's really is a magical moment. So it's cool that you're still finding people who haven't experienced that and orange pilling them. That's really awesome.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the other thing is it's the battle of trying to get people off of custodial exchanges in a way. So this, it was a couple, right? And one of them had some coins on a custodial exchange, and I was basically telling them, hey, well, you've got to, do you have it in your own wallet or do you have it on the exchange? And they're like, oh, okay, because they didn't know, right? And I think that's just how early we are, that we think of it as it's totally standard to just have all your coins off the exchange, but there's all these people out there who they're not in this world. And so, they're not on Bitcoin Twitter. They're not, you have to find them and you have to sort of teach them. The only way you do that is by making a personal connection, I think. So I think that's maybe another angle. But I'm curious your thoughts as well in terms of orange pilling people, although I kind of cringe at that term sometimes. I sort of think of it like, let me put it this way. Okay. I know you're laughing, but it's like sometimes maybe it's the use of the term, right? People might say, oh, look, I just orange pilled my Uber driver, just got him on a wallet. And it's kind of like, well, if you got them on for example, if you got them on a custodial wallet, how much learning did they really do? It's sort of, maybe I'm being a little cynical, but I think orange pilling, really, it needs time. You need an ongoing relationship with that person to make it happen. What do you think?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good observation. I will say, though, that the term orange pill originally came from The Matrix, the movie The Matrix.
The red pill, yeah.
The red pill. If any of your listeners have not seen that movie, I know it's one of those things where I think about something like that, and I remember watching that and thinking, this is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. But that's almost a quarter of a century ago, and maybe there are some listeners of yours who haven't seen it. Everyone should watch that movie. But I will say, Neo does take the red pill in the movie, and he does go down the rabbit hole. But that's not the beginning. That's not the end of his journey. He's in the Matrix, and he's learning what the Matrix is, and then he's learning all these skills. Now I know Kung Fu. So
now I know lightning.
Exactly. Now I know lightning. Now I know how to self-custody. Now I know multi-sig. So I think you can also have a charitable interpretation of orange pilling, which is it's just the beginning. It's not the end.
That's a good point. That's a good way to put it. When it comes to Bitcoin technology, right? Of course, you're a software engineer, developer yourself, and of course, obviously you've been following what's happening in the Bitcoin space. Do you see it like Bitcoin technology needs to be improved so that more people can be onboarded into this thing, or do you see it more like that's kind of orthogonal, like it's not the most important thing? Like I'll give you an example. If it was easy to, let's say, have a Lightning address, and you had like your Bitcoin Lightning wallet with a contacts in it, and it was easy for people to fling sats around to each other, do you think that's actually what it will take to sort of get that next wave? Or do you think it's just independent, that people will just come into it, you'll see these waves up and down, just independent of the technology?
I think the core technology, the core network, I think is actually incredibly valuable, that it's not that exciting, that it's boring in a way, that it's stable. You want that, core technology to be stable because it's the base for a new form of money. And money is not something you want to be constantly changing. Gold wouldn't have been money if it constantly morphed into copper or something like that. You want to be able to rely on it. I think with something like Lightning, it's certainly exciting for innovators and enthusiasts. But I have a kind of controversial opinion on this, which I know we've talked about many times, is that I don't think merchant adoption is going to happen for a while. I really think the most important thing with Bitcoin is providing easy on-ramps for people to get into Bitcoin, and then getting them, going down the rabbit hole to get them more interested in self-sovereignty and holding their own Bitcoin, and then multi-sig. I think there is value in those things becoming more user-friendly. I still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, both in the ease of the on-ramps, and this, maybe another controversial opinion. I think an ETF is a good thing for Bitcoin, because I think that we need people to be exposed to Bitcoin and have more financial energy come into Bitcoin. And then I think we can focus on the other stuff. We need to make it easier for people to self-custody. Some people, though, unfortunately, I just don't think are ever going to do that. I just think they're not capable of that. We may be able to get to a better halfway solution, say, where they use a multi-sig solution, something like that Unchained has.
Like a collaborative custody, yeah.
A collaborative custody, and then you have wealth managers who will work with them and help them along that process. I think that is a really happy middle ground that I hope that we can get many more people into eventually. Yeah. But really, for me, I still think we're at the point where we need to focus on the on-ramps, making the on-ramps as easy as possible, making sure they're safe, secure, and making sure that as we're getting people from those on-ramps to self-sovereignty, that is easy, and beautiful user interfaces and ways of helping users not shoot themselves in the foot. A lot more work needs to go into that. I think we're still many, many years away from something where I can, give it to my mom and say, here, put your Bitcoin on this, and, go to Swan or River and buy Bitcoin and put it on your wallet. I still feel that that process, that experience isn't there for the laggards in our population, the people who are so far behind on technology adoption because everything seems scary to them. I hope that the Bitcoin community focuses on that. I don't want to criticize the people who work on Lightning because it's so cool and so exciting, and eventually it will be important, but I don't think it's going to be massive. It's not going to be a massive driver for adoption just yet.
I see, yeah. So I'm curious what you think. I've got two comments. One comment would just be, certainly, I agree with you about on-ramps. That's probably the most important thing. The most important thing is to get more new hodlers, and I think that's going to happen over time, whether you or I do anything about it or not. But nevertheless, I think that's the economically important step. But I'll just point out, though, that there may be some people who might use Lightning as their way of onboarding. There may be some people who earn on Lightning. But I guess in fairness, you could say that a lot of people will buy coins over Lightning as opposed to or buying coins just on chain, let's say, as opposed to earning on Lightning. But I think the other point I'm curious. Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say there is some magic to telling someone, hey, just download a wallet and I'll shoot some sats to you, and it happens instantly. You can see the power of Bitcoin, but I don't think that's quite as powerful. Being given Bitcoin is not quite as powerful as buying it yourself. There are so many people who were given Bitcoin who just weren't that interested in it. When you have your own psychological stake in putting your own money into it and getting over the hump, then you're more invested emotionally.
Yeah.
And I find those people are the ones who really become Bitcoiners and start to understand why Bitcoin is a superior form of saving. So Lightning does have advantages in that you can do these cool things and show people the potential of Bitcoin. But I still think ultimately you need people to say, I just want to buy Bitcoin. I want to save in Bitcoin, and making it easy for them to do that, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's totally fair. One other comment on the ETFs aspect, because while I agree it's good to bring people in, and oftentimes you can't expect 0 to 100 perfection. I am curious your thoughts on whether you think, let's say a lot of people get into an ETF and they don't even bother. If those people never self-custody, does that present some kind of systemic risk to the system of Bitcoin? Does it compromise Bitcoin in some way? Or do you think that basically Bitcoin would survive that and it's not a concern?
I do worry about that. I really honestly do, because, I cut my teeth. I really became interested in participating in the Bitcoin community during 2017 with the block size wars. Yeah. And that was a really scary time, because all of these very powerful interests inside the Bitcoin community looked like they wanted to increase the block size, which would have been a huge disaster for Bitcoin. The major companies involved, many of the largest holders at the time, people like Roger Ver, were arguing for this, and the miners as well. The most powerful miner was like, we need to do this, and they were threatening starving the main chain of hash power. So I do worry about the concentration of power if someone like a BlackRock suddenly has 10% of the supply of Bitcoin under an ETF, and if you ever have a fork that they could use that economic power to push the market in a particular direction. I do worry about that. I would say, though, that people who run their own nodes are self-sovereign, and they can always ditch whatever the majority will do. I think a company like BlackRock would be ideologically neutral, and they wouldn't have a strong position in this. They might lean kind of the wrong direction, but ultimately people follow whoever has the strongest conviction. And I wrote this in 2017. One of the reasons I knew that the S2X fork would fail was they had no conviction at all. I said, look guys, you do your fork, we'll do our fork, and I will sell all of my tokens to you. You give me your Bitcoin, and you take my new S2X tokens. And none of them would take that. No, they didn't have any internal conviction. Whereas the hardcore people, the people who really believe in Bitcoin, believe in an ideology. They have conviction in their heart about what is valuable about Bitcoin and what makes it special. Those people, I think, will drive the direction of Bitcoin, not the kind of big behemoths that don't really have any view or not have any ideology about Bitcoin. And ultimately, if they try and go the wrong direction, we'll just say, fuck you, we're going the other way, and we'll see who lost. Your kind of shitcoin that you created, which doesn't have any of the properties that make Bitcoin unique, its immutability and its censorship resistance, and we'll go our own way, and that's fine. Eventually people will find that the value will move to the platform which has the strongest monetary characteristics, and immutability is that really big one. So it does worry me. I'm not going to deny that there's no world in which they could have a negative impact, but I think they're not going to be so ideologically driven that they're going to move the market. It's people like you and me who really believe in Bitcoin for a particular reason that are going to push the market in a particular direction. And if it doesn't go in our direction, we'll just do our own thing and we'll do our own real legacy Bitcoin thing, and they can have their shitcoin.
Right. And I think it's also good to point out that BlackRock and other entities will look back at what happened in 2017 and say, well, there's a chance here that you could really split things off and see, well, if you look at what the price of Bcash is now or the price of BSV is now, I mean, it's tiny. It's like well below 1% of what BTC is. And so I think it sort of becomes more and more clear that if you play those sort of games, you're going to risk this kind of thing. And so we'll see what happens with that. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to how many people are coming into this system, and ideally how many of those people are self-custodying their Bitcoin, of course. And so I think it really does just come back to the on-ramp question, like you said. So I guess, do you have any other thoughts around Bitcoin? Well, I guess you kind of answered that. I was going to ask a little bit around some of the technology stuff like the soft forks and things like this. But at the end of the day, happens or not, I mean, it's more about the monetary qualities of Bitcoin. And so, if there's like a soft fork in a long time, that's not a big deal. It's not that, that Bitcoin needs to change so quickly and so rapidly. And I think I agree with you on that.
As long as it has, very strong consensus, I think eventually you have ossification in terms of hard forks. I don't think we're going to see any more hard forks. We might see soft forks for Bitcoin, but I think eventually even those are going to go away and Bitcoin will just be what it is and it won't change at that base layer. I am interested, though, in one of the attributes of money that I think Bitcoin isn't absolutely ideal, which is privacy, which sort of goes, hand in hand with fungibility. And I'm really interested. I'm not an expert on this, and I know you have your head in the details more than I do, but whether Taproot eventually is going to make it possible to have better, more private Bitcoin, because you'll be able to have addresses where you have multiple signatures and you don't actually know who's signing for it. And that ability, will it make it possible for people to own Bitcoin in a way that's more private and gives stronger fungibility properties to Bitcoin? I'm really interested to see how that plays out over the next few years, because I know Taproot was adopted not too long ago, but it takes many, many years for us to sort of see the benefit with the adoption of a new technology like that. Just like SegWit, it took years before people were really comfortable using SegWit addresses. I think the same thing will be true with Taproot. The benefits are going to take some time, but that's something I'm very curious about. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, actually.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I mean, the quick answer, at least as I understand it, is that there are some ways in which Taproot allows some of the privacy heuristics to be undermined, but there are other privacy heuristics that still remain that are still possible to analyze, and that's where some of these blockchain surveillance or Bitcoin surveillance firms will use that. Now, of course, there is a big argument about whether it's it's a black box, is it snake oil? Are they not even that confident about the ability of their algorithms to detect exactly what's happening? But I think the short answer is that Taproot will enable some things that are going to give us some more privacy. So, for example, you could imagine in the future with Lightning, if they get PTLCs, that may enable some more privacy there. We may start to see more of these protocols that allow multiple people to have a threshold multi-signature, but it looks on-chain like a single signature. So a good example of that is Music 2 and Frost. Music 2 just recently is in production at BitGo, a big custodian. I did an episode recently with Brandon Black talking about the process they went through for that. And I think hopefully in the future, as long as obviously there's consensus and people are on board with it, I think some of these soft fork ideas like APO or CTV or that functionality may enable more other privacy in other ways too. So as an example, there may be people who use things like coin pools or payment pools and get some privacy in that way. And, so there's work being done in this area, but like you said, it all takes time. And so even though Taproot came in was it 2020 or late? I can't remember now. Maybe early 2021. I can't remember. There's still, development that's just recently hitting. So, for example, Lightning Labs and LND recently enabled Taproot channels. So they're using Taproot as part of Lightning channels. So there's all these things that it takes time for development to happen. So, I think focusing out on the long term, getting some of these improvements, as long as people agree on them and are bought into the idea, then, that could really help. And of course, I think in the future, there's this idea of cross-input aggregation, which would also be a soft fork idea. So there are ideas around that if we aggregate across inputs, then maybe there's privacy wins that we could gain as well as scalability wins. So yeah, some of that is kind of in the future, but I am optimistic that there'll be further development on these things and that enough people can come to consensus that they'll say, look, we think this has been tested. We think it's safe. It's not going to harm Bitcoin. It's not going to, and crucially, it's not going to harm people who don't want to opt into it. So, for example, things like APO. If you don't want to use, APO, you don't have to, and it doesn't harm the non-APO users. So, I think those are a few of the examples where hopefully we'll see improvements in the technology there. But It continues regardless, even if we don't have any soft forks. There's still a lot of technology and improvements coming. So I guess that's kind of my take on it. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I mean, it definitely sounds like there's potential for improvements to privacy in Bitcoin's future, even if that's a few years down the road. The potential that Taproot has made possible is there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, okay. Well, I guess I'm looking forward to seeing you at Pacific Bitcoin as well. So I know you've been announced for that, and looking forward to seeing you there.
I'm really excited to go. It's going to be my first time. I guess it's the second conference. I wasn't there the first time. I heard amazing things about Pacific Bitcoin. I love Bitcoin-only events, and I get to, for the first time ever, present the bullish case for Bitcoin, which is, I find a little crazy. I've been to so many conferences and they've been asked to speak at, a lot of them, but no one's ever asked me to present the bullish case for Bitcoin. So I'm excited to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I think one really cool thing with Pacific Bitcoin is you actually do get a chance to it's a really great vibe. So you really get a great chance to actually connect with speakers and people and just meet really cool Bitcoin people. So I'm looking forward to that. But I think that's probably it's probably a good spot to finish up there. So Vijay, I'm looking forward to seeing you around, and I'll catch you at Pacific Bitcoin.
I'll see you soon, Stephan.
I hope you enjoyed the discussion about Bitcoin as a macro asset and the 4-year cycles. I will look forward to seeing you at Pacific Bitcoin as we discussed, and you can find my show notes at stephanlivera.com. Thanks, and I'll see you in the Citadels.